again! Welcome to tonight's episode of the Dead Astrologer Society. I'm Donna Woodwell, your host for the evening, and I'm feeling uncontainable, so I will not describe myself tonight. You are listening to episode 16, where we are talking with author David Perkins about his new book, Hitler's Astrologer. So that is a subject that needs no explanation. This is the story of the astrologers who worked with the Third Reich and the Nazi Party in the Second World War, and how that played out in the realms of wartime propaganda, and what the British response was. So I'm so excited that we're talking about this tonight, because I think this is a fascinating tale of astrology, intrigue, magic, occult, and propaganda. And of course, war. And as David has said himself, Nazis are always a fascinating topic. So I'm here tonight with David. He is an astrologer and an author of the new book. He will introduce himself in just a moment and how he got interested in the topic. I am also here with Enid Newberg, the president of Kepler College, who is serving as my co-host tonight because she is equally fascinated with the concept of this great new book, which is a historical novel, by the way. Hi, Enid.
Hello.
Good to talk to you tonight. Welcome. I'm glad you could be here as we talk to Dave.
I'm glad to be here, too.
Yeah, we were having a little bit of an audio problem a second ago, so I want to make sure. David, are you still there? Can you still hear us?
Yes, I am, and I hope y'all can hear me okay.
Excellent. Well, welcome to the show tonight. I'm glad you can be with us. I am so excited to have you talking about this book. I remember when I saw it come out and you made the announcements on Facebook, I'm like, I got to read that book. That sounds like a very fun story, and of course the Dead Astrologer Society is all about stories. So tell us a little bit about your book, and for the audience, our audience are not astrologers. They're a general audience that's interested in metaphysics. So for those who are not familiar with the story, talk about Hitler's Astrologer.
Well, okay. Well, actually, I came across an individual that worked in a department of the SS called the Dark Sun. And I guess this department is was the area that was sort of touched into when the Indiana Jones movies came out, that these were the Nazis that were running around the world the same time Indiana Jones was, that he was collecting artifacts. But I was just playing chess in the park, and, he goes, your German's good, but you're not from Germany, are you? And I said, no, I'm actually from Texas. And he goes, oh, you're an American. When the French captured me, they treated me like a dog. He goes, but when the Americans came, they treated me like a human being. And I went, well, in my mind, I'm going, well, thank God some lieutenant did it right, because, it's not always fun to be an American overseas. But it turned out after talking with him, I was writing for a German weekly women's magazine called Bild der Frau, which means pictures for women. It's kind of like a Look magazine or Life magazine of Germany. And I was doing their astrology column there during the 80s, and of course everybody around said, "Oh yeah, that's Herr Perkins. He's the astrologer for this and this, and for Bild Zeitung and all this." And he goes, "Oh, well, I used to be an astrologer too during the war. I worked with Himmler and started naming all these Nazi names." I'm going, "Whoa, wait a minute," because I was into astrology, and I primarily took an interest on it from the ancient Greeks or what was done in Mesopotamia and modern times. But he started talking about, one of the central characters in the book, which is named Karl Kraft. And I was really lucky to be able to interview him, although I was just a curious guy talking to him. I guess now we could call it an interview, and I guess later on that it would be, something of a research. Of course, I wasn't aware of this at the time. I was just fascinated by it and said, would ask him questions, and he showed me like his ring that was the symbol of this organization, and a lot of photographs. He had some film of him when they went to the ancient grounds that they thought the Aryan race started from, which is northern India and up in Tibet and all. That's why that was one of the first places that they went to. Back in the mid-30s when they started doing these excavations, because they felt that was, according to the Vril Society, which got started at the turn of the century, that's where the Aryan race originated. I'm going to pause and take a drink right now so you can ask me a question.
go from, I think anyone who's seen Raiders of the Lost Ark is familiar with the idea of Nazi fascination with mythology and stories and legends as a way to bolster the credibility of the Nazi mythology. How do we go from there to interest in astrology?
Well, actually, one of the characters who you'll come across, and his name is Faisal, and he's one of the people that's working in the Dark Sun. And of course, he's the one that's sort of heads up the use of the occult in this particular department that Karl Kraft was working in. And he, as many that were in this department, read Sanskrit. And of course, when you see, in your textbook, you have a lot of maybe pictures of writing from Samaria, and the textbook will go, well, this is the earliest record of writing that we have, which is 6,000 years ago. And when he broke it down and started looking at what was being said, about a third of it was about agriculture, and most of it was tie-in with the moon. That was they were using the moon in order to decide when to plant their crops, basically. And they also took a lot of the characteristics that we have in that came about in ancient Greek times, that is, to get a description of the personality, actually originated in these documents of the description that we get from agriculture. For example, Aries, we say, straightforward. They're not thinking about the past. They're not thinking about the future. It's now. That's the moment. That's the seed opening up, which that moment is the most crucial part. The next phase is Taurus. That's when the little root comes out and, goes in the ground, like a sprout or something when you see the root coming out. And that depiction of what is necessary, which is steadfast. And that translates into the human description as being, stubborn, for example, because it was necessary during that particular phase of the plant, that the root take fast, in other words, in order to start to grow. When the top part of the plant comes up, now you have two parts of the plant. That's Gemini, as far as the duality of it. Part of the plant is going, hey, it's sunny and warm and windy, and the bottom part of the plant is going, no, it's dark and wet, and there's that duality. In other words, I don't want to go through all 12 signs, but every description that we have in astrology as far as the characteristics actually originated in these Sanskrit writings, and they were describing the entire process of growth. And I guess if you look at it, if it's something of the earth, whether it's a plant or a human being, because we all share the earth, I guess it would be, you could be applicable that we all do share similar phases. But I thought it was really amazing when I was translating this stuff that, wow, what they were learning, what they were describing here as far as agriculture really matches later on when the Greeks start to do it. About the other third that was written was your society things, what was going on in politics, buying and selling of cattle. And then the other third was primarily about the Anunnaki, which is a people, what they call the star people. And these people came down and, from the stars, and it actually described, some of the vehicles and everything that, that these people had used. And so, of course, when the Nazis, and they did, the Germans at that time, at the turn of the century, they were the ones that were really looking at, astrology scientifically. You had the Hamburg School that opened up in 1910 in Hamburg, and you have, the first remnants on where they start looking at astrology in a scientific way. And of course, the character who I basically centralized the entire story on, Kraft, is one of the first people to apply statistics in looking at astrology as far as, the type of jobs people have, when a certain, planetary aspect happens, statistically what seems to happen the most. And of course that went on with Gaquin, the famous French guy that did the athlete study with the athletes in France. That was basically just a piggyback off what was being developed from the Germans.
Okay, so Karl Ernst Kraft, Swiss astrologer, an astrologer of his day, going around speaking at the Berlin Astrological Society. How in the world did he come to the attention of the Nazis?
Well, Kraft, besides being really a fantastic astrologer, and we'll get into later about some of the predictions that he made true, he was the authority on Nostradamus. That is, and he was recognized, well, of course, he was Swiss, so nobody tied him in, with Germany or Nazis because he was from Switzerland. But he was recognized all over the world as far as his interpretations, him finding matching elements of history to a particular Nostradamus quatrain or passage. So he was well known for that. And it turned out that what brought him into working with the Nazi Party was Joseph Goebbels' wife, whose name is Magda Goebbels, and she was highly into the occult as well. We often don't get to see, a lot about her, or really a lot of the ladies that were important in the Third Reich, but she was she was called the First Lady of the Third Reich for a reason. She had a lot of influence. They describe her as having a mind really just as good as any one of the generals. But what she did was she was reading one of the quatrains, and basically translated, it said that the British ruling dynasty is going to change so many times after 290 years, and when this happens, there's going to be a great war when Germany invades a Germanic tribe on the other side of the Vistula, who are going to be protected by Great Britain. Well, if you add 290 years to when he talked about this event, the starting point, you get 1939. The fact that Germany went across the river, they called it a Germanic tribe, but Magda Goebbels recognized that area was Poland, and of course they did have a treaty with Great Britain, and that's what started the Second World War. So Nostradamus in this passage actually predicts World War II, and she goes, well, a lot of the Nostradamus passages are not, you can't really put your finger on it. How about we take certain passages like this one, and then we add another one next to it to where we interpret it as being a Nazi victory, and then we can put these into the astrology magazines of all the neutral countries so that most people will think that Germany's going to win the war because Nostradamus said that they were going to do it. So that was originally the idea on why he got called over. So he went to Berlin, started working with them, and then in the process of working with them, and it turned out to be Goebbels' wife again, she comes up with the idea to use astrology for a tactical military purpose, in that she realizes that a lot of the French, peasants are the ones that mostly read a lot of the astrological magazines that were produced in Switzerland and in France. And the fact that Nostradamus was, so to speak, their hometown boy, that was very, very popular in France because he's one of their most, famous historical figures, that she says, well, look, here's what we can do. We can put out a passage that will tell that if there's invasion, that everybody should go to this particular area, and they'll be safe. And of course, she's basically talking about an area that was in the, toward the southern part of France. And Goebbels go, well, wait a minute, that is going to be a safe place. Why are you telling the French what to do? And she goes, well, look, first of all, the only people that are going to do this are the farmers and the peasants and everybody that reads Nostradamus, because generals are not going to listen to a Nostradamus prediction in order to make their plans. But what happened was, when the Germans invaded, of course, they went through Belgium, which everybody thought was the main attack, but basically they swept through the Ardennes, which encircled everybody in Belgium. But what protected them, or helped protect them, that no armies came from the south, is because the roads were completely, clogged up and jammed with all these peasants that were heading south, Now, they had the Maginot Line down there, but they still had reserve units, and those guys couldn't get up. They were blocked for weeks, which is, of course, what they didn't need to. So besides being a propaganda tool, which is what it originally, it actually was used for a tactical purpose in the military. And, I mean, that's the first time that it was ever engineered that way. But if you look throughout history, a lot of times astrology, and I don't want to say that the generals were considering astrology, but the fact is, the moon, for example, even as far as Operation Desert Storm, that started the bombing on the night of a new moon because we had the technology to be able to see in the dark where they didn't. Now, here's where I always get in an interesting conversation, let's say, with other people. They go, yeah, well, the moon didn't cause it. And I say, well, I'm not saying the moon caused the war to start there. It's just that for tactical reasons, the military decided to make their attack then when the new moon was going on because it was completely dark. And that had been done since, the time of King David in Israel. Let's use the moon when it's this in order to do it. So it's interesting. We can't say that, necessarily these conditions, something caused it, but the fact that parallel or people made their decision based on that, in my opinion, does show a relationship.
Well, and it's fascinating, the couple levels of astrology. There's the astrology of the prediction of events based on astrology, and then there's the recognition of astrology as a social force of itself, something that can inspire a whole bunch of people to clog up the roads, and that Magda Goebbels had the vision to realize that there's two sides of this.
Yeah, well, she was, like I said, when you. I wish there was, more books and stuff written about her, or somebody would, take a thing. I mean, she's a fascinating character as herself. I mean, she was, she first got married to this super wealthy industrialist, and, they actually came to the States, and there was a problem because apparently, I mean, I don't want to sound like a soap opera episode out of Dallas or the Denver Dynasty, but she actually had an affair with, President Hoover's, nephew. And he fell madly in love with her and actually followed her back to Berlin. And when she got divorced, he was actually chasing her to marry him. But actually, when Hitler rose to power, she was actually attracted to Adolf Hitler at first. But Hitler, first of all, she was a divorcee. She had kids, and Hitler, of course, he did make it known. But he was an avid person that said, "I'm not ever going to get married." So basically, he engineered the wedding. It was sort of an arranged wedding because he wanted to have her as the first lady of Germany in the same way that, the Roosevelts had Eleanor, because, Eleanor was, doing all these causes and getting people involved in a way that no first lady ever had. So he wanted to have that happen in Germany. So he arranged it, and of course, Goebbels was the best suited for this. To have a family, and the whole thing of them having a lot of kids was in order to be the model Nazi family. Have a lot of kids, to create a lot of soldiers, in other words. And also the fact that she was from a very high class, that gave the Nazi party some class, because most of the people that were, starting out, I mean, German working parties, it was, they always highlighted whoever they could get, like if it was a famous general, one of them in the earlier times followed him when he was going through the push. And of course, they put him up front. But Magda Goebbels was sort of the representative that, see, somebody that has class and is, really high up there in society is a member of the Nazi Party and an important member. And that had a lot to do with attracting a lot of people. So she's a fascinating character in that she really had a lot to do with the growth and development of the Nazi Party. And like I said, she was a very intelligent woman. She could have been a general. She could have been a political, leader or anything. And she did actually, a lot of her ideas came from behind the scenes.
It's interesting because the Nazis banned fortune-telling and certainly went after astrologers. So it sounds like the ones lucky enough to come to her attention for being put to at the very least, to propaganda use, were a bit fortunate.
Well, I'll tell you the Nazi Party as general basically did not go after astrology until Hess flew to Scotland. Actually, Hess was known to be a very good astrologer himself. And let me bring this together with Kraft as far as when Hitler came to power in 1933, he did Hitler's chart, and he did 3 predictions on it. Number 1, this guy's going to get us Germany in a war in the fall of 39, and that the second one is if Germany and Great Britain doesn't make peace by the summer of 1941, the tide's going to go against Germany. And the third one was the war is going to end in 1945. Of course, he didn't say who was going to win or not. He just put that on there. But Hess, by the way, he grew up in Egypt. His mother was very, very much into astrology. And she taught him at an early age about astrology, got him into the Egyptian mysticism while they were there. When he came back to Germany, he wasn't a practicing astrologer, so to speak, that he did it for other people to relate it with them, but he did the charts of everybody he met. That was one of the things that he was captivated by Hitler about, because, when he met Hitler, he did his chart, and, he would do that on anybody, make their chart in order to relate with them, in order to find out, who they were and everything. And that's why he was just automatically, because according to Hitler's chart, he was going to be, a leader role, and, he knew of the magnitude. Of course, he didn't know positive or negative, but he knew of the magnitude that Hitler was going to have in Germany. So that's why he stuck with them right in the very beginning. But also that prediction that Kraft made about whether or not the tide of the war was going to change in the summer of 41. That's why Rudolf Hess flew to Scotland, was in order to make peace. Because he knew that if, it looked like the war wasn't going to end soon, that he knew that pretty soon the Germans were going to invade Russia, which is just going to extend it even more. So when he flew there, that was based on an astrological prediction. And I find it very interesting that a lot of textbooks will say, oh, we don't know why he went over there. I mean, it's obvious. There's documented reports that he stated that to several people. He had the papers that were on it. Plus, Hitler knew about it, too, because when he did this, the very next day, Hitler made an order called Axia Hess, which means Action Hess, and that's when they arrested all of the astrologers. But before then, they were tolerated. In fact, there was a lady named Frau Ubertine, who was a lady in Hamburg. And of course, by the way, I lived in Hamburg. That's when I was living in Germany. So it was the Hamburg school still has all this stuff and everything in the library. There was a fan of Hitler that wrote to Frau Ubertine and said, hey, there's this guy, here's his birth information. You should hear him speak. He's really cool. Tell me about him. And she did her chart of Hitler, and she stated on there really everything that, pretty much Hess probably knew, that he was going to be have a Führer role, that is a leader role in Germany in a very big way. And when this got back to the lady, and she, I think, met Hitler and told her about it, that you're going to be a leader, that's when Hitler started to tell everybody in the Nazi party to say, call me leader. Don't call me, Mr. Herr Hitler or anything. I want to be called Der Führer. But when you were in his company, you had to say, my Führer. And there's a tie-in that there's no proof that when they had that conversation that he decided to do that. He didn't state that was what, but I find it interesting that that's when it happened. That this lady that did his chart up in Hamburg, this was before Hitler became a nationwide figure. He was still just a little guy causing trouble in, Bavaria, and he never had a crowd of 200 or 300 in a beer hall. But this lady in Hamburg, of course, didn't know about him, but accurately described him. It was pretty amazing on it. But anyway, going back to Hess with that, when Hitler did Axia Hess and had all the astrologers arrested, that's when the pattern came forth that the Nazi Party did not tolerate astrology, because Hitler felt that astrology influenced Hess, so he's going to wipe out all the astrologers. And of course, the main character in the story here, the Karl Kraft, he gets arrested with this too, but they pull him out because there's several generals that want to use him. They were thinking about doing it because, Montgomery and Patton were starting to give Rommel trouble in Africa, so they wanted to give Kraft the job of doing the horoscopes of Patton and Montgomery in order to find out what type of weaknesses that they might have. This has been done historically.
Hey, David, this is so brilliant and fascinating that I want to come back and spend a lot more time talking about the Allies, how they responded, how Kraft analyzed their charts and things like that. But we have to take a break for our sponsors. We have already flown through the first half hour. Can you believe the first half hour is already gone? So we will be back in a few minutes. I hope you stay tuned, enjoy the music, and we will be right back. Welcome back to episode 16 of the Dead Astrologer Society, where we are here, we being Enid Newberg of Kepler College, talking to the author and astrologer David Perkins about his new book, Hitler's Astrologer. He was just telling us before we left about how Karl Ernst Kraft, Hitler's astrologer, had looked at the charts of the Allied forces generals to see how that might change the course of the war. And before I interrupted you for the break, so let's go back there, David, and talk about what kind of information that gave to the Nazi war effort.
Okay, well, first, let me give another example on why people do that and it's useful. On the other side of the war over there in the Japanese, when we were fighting over there, they did a character, I don't know if they used their astrology or not, but they did a character analysis on Halsey that when the Battle of Leyte Gulf, they did a plan to where they would put some aircraft carriers that were empty up in the north because they understood Halsey enough to know that he would go up there and chase them, even though tactically that wouldn't be a wise move to move away from the invasion force. Well, believe it or not, that's exactly what he did, and that battle almost became a disaster because when the real threat came over on the islands and where the people were landing, the aircraft carriers weren't around to protect the troops. So that's an example of knowing your enemy, and of course the Germans were masters of this. In fact, one of the Tuskegee airmen, when he was shot down, when he went into interrogation, he said he was flabbergasted by how much the Nazis knew about him personally. They had pictures of him in flight school. They know what school he went to. They even know what grades he had. I mean, that's how, as far as knowing your enemy, they were into doing that. Well, of course, when Patton and the Germans recognized Patton as being America's best general, and of course Montgomery, when they started to have success, the Germans wanted to understand, their enemies a little bit better, and they pulled Kraft out of prison in order to do these charts. Of course, he worked with them and gave advice as far as which one. In fact, they didn't tell him. They put 5 generals in front of him, and they gave him Rommel's chart, and then they gave him 5 British charts. And they said, who do you think is their best generals? Of course, the Nazi high command already knew that Montgomery was going to be the one that was being over. And of course, Kraft didn't because he was in prison and, was out of touch anyway. And Kraft picked Montgomery. That is to say that this is the guy that's, that they're, is your strongest chance, and he's the one that matches up against Rommel the best. So, that was his sort of ticket out of jail. And then,
well, why did he get in jail in the first place?
I beg your pardon?
First he was free. He was advising on Nostradamus. How did he get in jail?
Well, when Hess flew to Scotland.
Oh, this was after.
Hitler had,
this was a little later in the war.
Hitler had all of the astrologers arrested, and him being one of them.
Okay.
That is anybody, So basically, that was his ticket out of jail, and certain others were released later. Some of them were to do charts. Some of them because they had experience with oh God, I forget what it's called. What do you do when you have a little piece of metal on a string and you put it over a table and it starts to move around?
Using a pendulum for dowsing?
Pendulum, that's it. I'm sorry. Yeah, you're right. Believe it or not, when we had sonar and were starting to sink a lot of the submarines, one of the people in the Admiralty noticed that in the late 20s there was a pendulumist that said, I can find any one of your ships, out. And, of course, he didn't believe him. And then the guy with the pendulum found one of the ships because the admiral knew where it was, but he didn't. He got a map of the North Sea and found out where his ship was. So the Nazis, because when they started losing their submarine, thought that the British had hired a whole bunch of pendulumlists in order to find their submarines. So some of the people that were in astrology that had experience with pendulums, they were pulled out of jail in order to go into the Nazi naval camp in order to put pendulumists so that they would mess up the pendulumists that were working in Great Britain. But no, that actually did happen. So that's how some of them. Kraft got out originally. He was one of the first because he was the most highly respected on charts and predictions. And, there's so much that could be said about him. He's one of the first people to really analyze and look at the transits of Pluto. And you realize that they discovered it in the 1930, and he would only investigated it for about 6 or 7 years, but already found that Pluto changed sign when when World War I started. It went into Cancer, and that was one of the things that he used for his prediction on when World War II was going to start, because Pluto went into Leo in the fall of 39. So it almost marked that perfectly, as at least for those instances. And of course, he didn't have but a couple of years to work with it, but already made an ephemeris for it, going, I think, 100 years back and 100 years in the future. So he was really a first-rate astrologer, and you got to be even more impressed with it when you realize this is pre-computer age. To do a chart back then took 6 books, and it took about 5 hours. To do the, rhythm and everything. Right now, we can just put it on the computer and it figures it up real quick for us. But to do all that work, when it really was a lot of work, is really incredible. But going back to him getting out of jail, like he got out to do the charts, then he got assigned to the V2 project over in Peenemünde, because he understood, planetary motion and trajectory and all those. And that pulled out a lot of astrologers too, because they needed people that were mathematicians for that type of, to get the arc of the missile so that it could reach London and to do all that kind of math. So that got a lot of the astrologers out of too. But, since we touched on Britain, let's go to what Britain did. And by the way, it's the British connection is the reason that most people thought that Hitler had a personal astrologer. I know I titled the book that, but Hitler didn't believe in astrology. And he may have listened to some of the advice because somebody told him. Kraft actually predicted one of his assassinations. So, and he heard about that and he goes, yeah, that's there. But the actual statement from Adolf Hitler is, if everybody believes that I believe in astrology and it scares them or messes them up, or what, then fine. Let them believe, let them believe that. But there's no record, or any of the people that I interviewed that were in those circles that really did the astrology that said that they worked personally for Hitler or that he ordered anything. He didn't. What made that belief become popular was the fact that there is a figure. He was a Hungarian immigrant. He lived in Germany, in Berlin, and he saw Karl Ernst Kraft with one of the higher, generals going into the Reichstag and the Ministry of War Department. So he puts 2 and 2 together to go, why is the greatest astrologer, from Switzerland over here in Berlin working with the Nazi in the War Department? And of course, he, because of his background, he needs to escape. He goes to England, and he basically goes to the British Secret Service and says, hey, guess what? I know why, the Nazis, beat you in Norway by 2 days, and I know why they outfoxed you here and outfoxed you there, and they're always one step ahead because they got Karl Kraft working for them. And if you hire me, then I will tell you what Hitler's hearing. And, von Voll, he understood the mechanics of astrology. He actually learned it a little bit later in life, and from what people said about him, I don't want to call him a quack because, he understood some of the elements and stuff on it. But basically, he was sort of into theater and writing, and he basically used it just to impress the girls so that he could, have them over, basically.
There's the astrologer and the self-promoting astrologer.
Yeah.
Yeah, those
In other words, hey, baby, what's your sign? Why don't you come home with me? I mean, it's kind of, if we were going to put it on there. I mean, those types exist, all over, and it's unfortunate. But it's interesting in this perspective because it carried through even when he was in England. Because one of the things that he demanded was that he be given the rank of captain. And it turned out that it wasn't necessarily for the pay because he was getting paid, by the Secret Service over there in Britain, and just the fact that, well, why do you want to be a captain? It's not going to change your work. It's not going to do anything from it. And believe it or not, it was to get the girls. Because if you had a uniform on, hey, that's what attracted the babes. So so this guy is really interesting, and he goes on later, actually, after the war. He writes some books about his experiences. Of course, he leaves out of the fact that they kind of weaned him away from the department. And the reason that happened, they had to do that quietly because, the government's spending tons of money on their counter group in order to go against the occult that the Nazis are doing. And they really don't have much justification for it. Plus, the guy that was in charge on it, who was actually Ian Fleming, by the way, the commander of this particular department. He went on later to write James Bond.
Of course. And call him after John D.
Yeah. He actually did a lot of unorthodox things as it was that a lot of his uppers didn't like. Like, for example, he recruited prostitutes from Holland and France in order to, get in with the generals in order to find out and get stuff on them. And, of course, to some attitudes of the British, that just was not, proper. It's funny that attitude even happened in our own government when you had one of the guys that was Secretary of State was appalled that we were reading the Japanese diplomatic code. That is, they were going, what? Gentlemen don't read other gentlemen's mail. I mean, that was the kind of attitude that you had with the people on top because, they were the traditionalists. They were in their 50s or 60s in 1940, so they grew up in where the attitudes are from 1880s or something, where gentlemen were gentlemen, or in World War I, where if you were in an airplane up in the sky and you were out of bullets, and the other guy realized you were out of bullets, they would just wave and go, go off. There was still some chivalry, so to speak. But he basically is a cad. I mean, he was a good writer. He made some plays. He did that before the war and after the war. But basically, that whole idea of Hitler having an astrologer, that basically came from him, and it basically came from the British side of the story.
So, did the British put out any? I don't know, what would we call it today? Counter propaganda using Nostradamus or their own astrological forecasts and plant them in any of the French or Swiss or other European astrological journals?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, they basically spent all their time trying to counter what the Nazis did. It's interesting that you mentioned that because, if you look at any or would talk with anybody or read any, thing up until Pearl Harbor, if you ask anybody in America, who do you think is going to win in Europe, everybody would say the Germans. It wasn't the fact of their successes. A lot of it had to do with the American astrological magazines, because a lot of the articles that were submitted were done by Germans. They were doing it with pen names. That would they had an agent here in America. The articles would be written in Germany. They would send them here, and then they would be submitted from an American address. saying, oh, this famous astrologer, says this or that. And even before we actually went to war with Germany, we still respected their astrology, to the utmost. I mean, for example, Teddy Roosevelt, this is one of the reasons that Hess wanted to apply astrology in the Third Reich as a government tool, was because he was aware of the fact that Teddy Roosevelt actually hired a bunch of astrologers from the Hamburg School even before he became president. He was using the astrologers from the Hamburg School when he was Secretary of the Navy. So the counter moves that the British did, I know that most of the effort that they did was trying to reveal this once they found out about it. So it wasn't that they really had time to go up and publish their own magazines to say, no, the British are going to win. That would be, it's too little too late. And, the only effort that really what they could do was just to say, hey, this is bogus. We found out that so-and-so and so-and-so were really working for the Nazis. So that was about as much counter moves that I've ever seen in researching this project.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you wrote this book, you chose it to write it as a historical novel instead of a scholarly treatise. I mean, we talked earlier before the show that, I have a book on my shelf by Alec Howe that's on the history of the Nazis, but it's not the kind that are filled with a million footnotes. So what made you decide to put this in a story version instead of a standard history textbook?
Well, I think that comes from being a teacher and loving history and teaching history. I found that most people respond to history when it's a story. I often, talk with my students. I say, all right, how many here, this is how I open up the whole school year. How many here, and I say, tell the truth. How many here don't like history? You think it's boring? And, the common line is, why do I got to study about a bunch of dead people? About 2/3 of them would raise their hand. And I said, okay, how many of you saw the movie, 300? And they all, oh, yeah, great, and all that, and I learned from that if you tell history, which is basically the way that it's taught in school or the way that you get it in an academic book, the only people that are interested in it are the people that are interested in that particular, area. If you got a book on astrology in World War II, then okay, those people that are interested in astrology in World War II, football players that want to chase cheerleaders might not be interested. However, if you tell it as a story, I think that satisfies a need of humanity that's existed since the time of cavemen. We respond to stories very well, whether it's a movie nowadays or somebody reads a gossip, column. People love stories. And I thought that would be a better way to tell it because it was my hope that that would sort of rekindle interest, in astrology and let the people research it. For example, if there's a passage in there about Karl Kraft, for example, did a chart at a party and there was a guy named Senator Prescott Bush there. And he was like, whoa, what is Senator Prescott Bush doing over dealing with the Germans? And then you find out, you Google it and you'll find out that he was actually buying and selling gold with Tyson Steel. Every fact that's in there, like I said about Magda Goebbels, running around in America with the nephew of Hoover, all that. If you Google all those things, those are true. And I think that makes it more interesting that when you read a story and you go, man, I can't believe this happened. And then they Google it and find out, whoa, that's true. Then that gives a second element of the story than if you just put a fact down and then have the citation. This happened over here, so-and-so said this, there's the citation. But if you tell it as a story, that gives a chance, first of all, to increase the interest because it's a story. And then second, you get to enjoy the story more because when you start to research it on your own, if you're that interested, then you find out, whoa, that really was true. And it will lead you on to another area of investigation that because you are the one that's researching it, you go from there, whereas I might have told another fact that might not be so interesting to you. Because you're researching it on your own, you follow the path that you want to do in order to satisfy your curiosity, what element of the story you're interested in.
And besides which, a lot of history seems to be juicier than your general soap opera.
Yeah. It was interesting when I visited Egypt one time because there was a lady when I wrote my German astrology column, I get letters from all over wherever the paper went, and there was a lady that worked at the Egyptian Museum, and I touched on one area that she was interested in, and we corresponded. So one time when I went to Egypt, I was able to go visit and look at all her work because I thought it was fascinating. Here's a person that's interested in astrology and, has the written records of, the ancient Egyptians from, 1,400 BC or something. And, she shows some of the, tablets and things like that are going on. And I noticed some of the writing over in another corner. And, this looks pretty interesting, too. I mean, all the little lines and the people doing something. And I go, wow, what does that say? And she goes, oh, well, this is a guy that owns this granary, and he's upset because his wife is running around with his cousin, and, it was gossip. It was gossip. It sounded like an episode, like I said, out of, some soap opera or Dallas or Dynasty from, a long time ago. It was just, but hey, it's history, it's true, and I guess the thing to get out of it is that, despite the technology, despite the education, people are people. They ran around then, but they just still pretty much live the lives pretty much the way that people do here. And I think that makes history relevant when people realize that begin to...
David, I'm so sorry, but we are almost out of time. Can you believe that an hour has flown by already? It just goes like magic. And I want to make sure we have the last few minutes talking about how people can find a copy of your book. So, David, how can people find you and order a copy of the book?
Well, it's going to be in bookstores on October 8th. I think Tate Publishing is the one that's doing it. But right now, you can just go to my chart, and my site, and it's just HitlerAstrologer.com. It's not the title of the book because it doesn't have the apostrophe S, but it's just the word Hitler and then the word astrologer.com. And there's a little video on there that sort of, gives you what I would call the academic background of the story. And then up at the top, there's a little thing that you can click on to see what we're doing as far as helping to make it a movie. And then there's a little tab on the top to get around on the book. And I'm sorry we're out of town because I wanted to go into the Vril and the last thing that Carl Kraft worked on, which is what's called the Bell, which is the anti-gravity device that's, rumored on that. But maybe we can save that for another time.
You're just going to have to save it for another time because we are unfortunately out of time again. So, Enid, how did they find you?
They find me through Kepler College, which is Kepler, KEPLER.edu.
Yay! So I want to thank both of you, David. I wish you much luck with your book. I hope everyone who's listening buys a copy. And Enid, thank you for sitting in as my co-host tonight. I am Donna Woodwell of Four Moons Astrology. You can find me at fourmoonsastrology.com or on Facebook, or you can also look up the Dead Astrologers Society also on Facebook or Twitter at just plain old Dead Astrologers. I look forward to seeing you next week when we're going to be talking about astrology and research. So tune in then, and thank you all for coming tonight.